In public session, dús bar bollam fáilte go roimh ar fad tachtan seo agus meabhradíobh na phone pócaí a bhuacha. Can I please remind witnesses, those in the audience and also members of the committee to turn off their mobile phones because they interfere with the recording system. So if you want to be heard properly and not interfered with by bleep, 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 switch off the phone. So today we have 4 witnesses present, and we've asked them to assist us in our consideration of the matter, why arts matter. So over the last year, the committee has undertaken a considerable amount of work in terms of looking at the arts in Ireland in its various forms and genre. And we had the benefit of meeting many organisations and people around the country. Today we're attempting to draw the phase of work to a conclusion, and then we will try to formulate a report based on what we've heard to date. So kind of the scripts that you've circulated and what you'll have to say in terms of your opening statements and questions will be recorded, but also will be included in the report when finally concluded. So before I ask each of you to address the meeting, I want to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that the opening statement and any other documents you have submitted to the committee may be published on the committee website after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So sin ráite gom, tuigeann sibh ar fada é tásúla gom. So chuir mé tús an lá nniu agus ar dús báire túra mé cuire inis de Gary Hines chur a láthair a dhéanamh.
Gur mágad, what do the arts mean to me? If I begin by saying that inherent in this question is the flawed thinking we tend to fall into when discussing the arts, that is not to denigrate the opportunity to articulate my view or the passion with which I will attempt to communicate it to you. The problem is the question suggests that there is an abstract entity out there called the arts, which has a greater or lesser degrees of meaning to different individuals. This is simply not true. Rather, I believe that creativity is fundamental to every human being, and that we are all creative beings at each and every moment of our lives, irrespective of background or education or the kinds of communities we live in. Fundamental to all human activity is the capacity to imagine. If there are some of us, like me, who become professional artists, I earn my living by using my imagination to collaborate with others in the making of professional theatre. It distinguishes me only from the person who uses their imagination to watch that piece of theatre by who pays our paycheck at the end of the week. I always think of myself as an accidental artist. Nothing in my background suggests for a second the life I was destined to live. Born in Balhadreen in the hungry 50s, the daughter of an exceptional teacher father and a wide, open-minded, supportive mother, I was privileged enough to expect an education at least to my late teenage years, and perhaps, if I was fortunate, a university education. This gave me the greatest gift of all, time to explore who I might become. In the usual act of teenage rebellion, I spent most of those years actively pursuing a life for myself, outside Ireland. It was only through those early, clumsy forays into putting on plays that I discovered how to be Irish. That the plays of an Irishman born almost 100 years before me, John Millington Synge, spoke more to my heart and my sense of self than all those American plays by my contemporaries. In those formative years, I was doing what we must all do to live meaningful lives. I was becoming part of a community. What is profoundly terrifying to me now is how carelessly and stupidly we are allowing ourselves to become isolated from one another, broken into blocks of entitlement and self-interest that ruthlessly disregard our need for the common good. To me, the fire and definition in my life and the lives of all others is the act of imagining. But that imagining, the practicing of art, however instinctive its origins, and whether it is in performance, singing, painting, or making film, or making music, needs always to be protected and nourished. It requires the making of structures to enable it, to facilitate participation in it by all, and to create the circumstances whereby makers can live decent and respected lives. And on that same point, I would like to read to you some stark facts recently published by Theatre Forum, which is the forum responsible for theatre performances. 1/3 of all performers in Ireland earn less than the minimum wage. 4/5 of the job in our sector in the performing arts are deemed to be precarious. 74% of actors rely on other income. 73% of organisations who make theatre and produce theatre do not make employment or health contributions to their members. This is shocking, and were it applied to any other industry in this country, we, all of us, would hang our heads in shame. Instead, it is tolerated. It is not acceptable in Irish society today that Irish actors earn below the living wage. It is not acceptable in Irish society today that one of our major national institutions is so apparently lacking in governance that fundamental disagreements as to its role and function in Irish life remain chronically unresolved. It is not acceptable today that the funding of our artists, whom we so clearly and obviously rely on to protect our national reputation, is the lowest per capita of income in the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen of the Committee of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, this and many, many other examples of our failure to protect our culture are not acceptable. I want to finish with what I think are prescient words from the final commencement address to his students at Juilliard, which is a major school for the arts in New York, by their long-term leader on his retirement, Joseph Polisi. And he said, quote, "Rather than being a subject of pious platitudes, the arts must be viewed as an essential part of our existence, which can be easily neutralised by an uncaring populace or an insensitive political leadership." This is a warning we would all do well to heed. Thank you.
Gary, agus inis, Éamon Philip King, Cor Láthir Yanathan Costa.
Gurnéil mágad a chahirdach agus a ghuiiniuiste is an ór dumsa bheithansa a bhór láthir ansa inúv. It's a prescient time looking at the pictures coming from the Mansion House on the 21st of January, 100 years on, and the reference that both Taoiseach and many other speakers, including the President, made to the democratic programme, was indeed a reminder of that time when the state and this state was founded. And 100 years on, I have to say that we do find ourselves in our world, in the world of arts and the world of creativity, in a very difficult place. And I would concur absolutely with everything that Gary has said and the numbers that she mentioned. And I'm not going to rehearse that again here. The arts matter for at least 4 sets of reasons. First, because creativity, culture and the arts are essential to our well-being and valuable in their own right as uniquely irreplaceable human activities. Second, for the individual and personal benefits that they confer by enabling us to imagine, invent, interpret and communicate diverse ways of seeing the world. Third, for the communal and societal value and diversity that they create, promote and share. And fourth, for the value that they add to our reputation globally and for their potential to strengthen Ireland's role in bilateral relationships by enriching common ground. John Tusa, who was the former director of the Barbican and an executive at the BBC for many years in London, puts it like this. He says, "The arts matter because they embrace, express and define the soul of a civilization. A nation without arts would be a nation that has stopped talking to itself, stopped dreaming, and had lost interest in the past and lacked curiosity about the future." I'm going to ask you just for a moment in terms of many times when I was on the Arts Council and when a new report would arrive about the value of the arts and, Indicon would produce yet another report and we would look at the executive summary of that report, and the beginning of the report would always say, for every euro that's invested in the arts, the return is X amount of euros. And everybody would run hot foot over to the Department of Finance with the new report, run up the stairs and say, look, we have it now, and, the officials in the department would look benignly at the report and say, thank you very much for bringing this to our attention, and nothing would happen. And I'm going to ask you, because as I was just saying a little earlier on, I attended the funeral of the late Mícheál Ó Cuív, and Mícheál and myself worked together a lot over the years. And one day we were chatting away about the value of the arts, why the arts matter. And we were talking about numbers. And Mícheál said to me, he said, there is no metric for the priceless. And I wrote it down many years ago, and how true is that? And I'm going to ask you to imagine something. If you looked at the depictions of Irish people, particularly as they left here in their hundreds of thousands after the famine, and we looked at those depictions of those people, and we looked at them and we said, well, they're not carrying any worldly goods, really. They don't have anything of value with them. And if one was being unkind, one might say, do you know what? These people really are fairly worthless, But when they arrived at their destinations, particularly on the great cities of the eastern seaboard of the United States, in Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, and they unpacked their emotional baggage, something of rare and powerful value became apparent. And there's a poem, I'm going to read it into the record here, written by the Donegal poet Moya Cannon, and it's called Carrying the Songs. And she says, it was always those with little else to carry who carried the songs, to Babylon, to the Mississippi. Some of these last owned less than nothing, did not own their own bodies. Yet 3 centuries later, deep rhythms from Africa stowed in their hearts and bones, they carry the world's songs. For those who left my country, girls from Downings and the Rosses who followed the herring boats north to Shetland, gutting the sea's silver as they went, or boys from Ranafast who took the Derry boat and slept over a rope in a bothy. Songs were their soul's currency, the pure metal of their hearts, to be exchanged for other gold, for other songs which ring out true and bright when flung down upon the deal boards of their days. I mean, it's exquisitely poignant, but what it tells us is that when those migrants, and they were migrants, left here, they carried in their heads, in their hands, and in their feet the emotional baggage of a whole country. And when they unpacked them, and the Irish songwriters in Tin Pan Alley met people like Irving Berlin, and the Irish and the Jews formed the music business. I say music business. Victor Herbert founded ASCAP, the first collection agency for collecting copyrights on songs. And not alone that, we left an indelible thumbprint on the making of the Great American Songbook, with which America colonized the world. When I turned on my radio as a 50s boy in Cork City, and I watched the radio heat up and the smell of the valves, and I heard rock and roll coming from American Forces Network based in Germany, I was turned on. I bought a pair of jeans, I got a harmonica, I bought into the thing, because where culture goes, commerce follows. And I think we're beginning to realise that here, just little by little. You know, the granular argument, the metric argument doesn't wash, because we're dealing with something that is priceless. And Gary, I think, alluded as well, you know, we're in a world that is a little bit more, how would you say, virtual. It's a little bit more augmented. It's a little bit more artificial. But we have something in our bag of imagination, that enables us to be tactile, human, and engaging in a way that is a very powerful antidote to what I would call the digitally lonely life, a screen-dominated life. And we have that in spades in this country. So when you're talking to Intel, and when you're talking to people in DCU, and you're beginning to talk about things like STEM and STEAM, science, technology, engineering and maths, the insertion of the A of arts into that acronym, we are looking at something very powerful. And two things are absolutely true, and the arts and what they can deliver are absolutely central to this proposition. Anything that cannot be automated is going to become very valuable. I'm going to say that again. Anything that cannot be automated is going to become very valuable. And secondly, as we head to a century of independence, independence, by my definition, paying our way in the world in an independent way, if we do not create the conditions where we grow, own and monetize our own intellectual property, we will never have a real wealth proposition that will address health, housing, education, etc. And it is the resource that Gary refers to, the natural occurring resource of imagination, that gives us the song, the poem, the film, the Oscar, and designs the chip that goes into the Intel box. It's the same thing. So these powerful elements of engagement and empathy are a sine qua non to a civilized, independent society. And I would just like to finish by reiterating what Gary said. It is shameful. It is shameful that we do not look at this resource and treat it with respect. Thank you.
Well, Margaret, Philip, you've left us already with a lot of things to think about, and we've listened to two more distinguished guests kind of on a day where Irish film has made substantial progress once again on the world stage, getting such nominations. So kind of, I won't delay on that. We'll come back to questions and comments from our guests. Mark Patrick Heatherman from the Gensall Abbey School, and I'm Céad Danella from Lowertling.
Bob Geldof, in his TV programme A Fanatic Heart, released on RTE for the centenary of 1916, makes this provocative suggestion. 100 years ago, a handful of Irish men and women rose up against the British Empire. A 6-day rebellion ended in their execution and elevation to near sainthood. But are they Ireland's greatest heroes? Is the GPO Ireland's most sacred place? To me, says Bob Geldof, it represents the birth of a pious, bitter, and narrow-minded version of Ireland. I couldn't wait to escape. But there was another version of Ireland dreamt up by a poet. His vision was mythical, romantic, truly heroic and beautiful. That was the Ireland I could never leave behind. Both Bob Geldof and Oliver St. John Gogarty agree there is no free state without Yeats, and both imply that Ireland does not exist without the arts. Others have suggested that since the beginning of the 20th century and the founding of our Free State, that we swapped British rule for 3 alternative colonizations: a particular brand of nationalism, a homegrown blend of Catholicism, and the prevailing Western culture of scientific realism. Now, we may agree or disagree, but one thing is certain. The 21st century is a cultural tsunami that has hit the whole world and washed away most signposts and values which constituted the Western world as we have known it up to now. So as we sit here now in Leinster House at the beginning of 2019, when all the isms of the previous century have worn thin, where do we go and to whom do we turn for a compass and a guideline on the way towards the future? It's not for me, or for anyone else for that matter, to provide a justification for art. Art needs no justification and will survive and will endure even where repudiated and persecuted. The words supposedly issuing from Nazi Germany about reaching for a gun whenever the word culture is mentioned have less dramatic and more subtle forms of asphyxiation which are more regularly applied. But let me, in the 10 minutes allotted here, give at least one good reason why art in this country must be supported and promoted at all costs. We cannot leave the future of Ireland to politicians alone. Our great dilemma is that we are trying to prepare ourselves for a world which we will never be able to forecast. Only imagination can help us to prepare for the future. How could any of us who grew up in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s have prepared ourselves for the world of text, Twitter, and tweet? The future is not something that we step into as an already designed space. The future is ourselves as we choose to become. And it is alive with possibility to the extent that we are open to change. Change occurs most profitably in the wake of fundamental shifts in our way of being. And these occur mostly because someone has imagined them and described them. Works of art are the first hints that we get, and artists are there to harvest possible shapes for the future and to sketch in outline what we might become. The future is in our hands. And obviously there are forces working, influences abounding, pressures surrounding, which diminish our autonomy and lessen our responsibility. However, it is still possible for those of us who live on this island as we approach the third decade of the 21st century to shape our future within the limitations and constrictions which global membership of the universe impose. There are many imperatives and considerations which should determine the steps that we take, but prominent among these should be the voice of artists and the educating influence of art. It is not the only factor, but it should be a decisive one. Art can provide an accurate and unflinching cardiograph of the present and a prognosis of possibilities for the future. And politicians and leaders ignore this at their peril. There may have been other times in history when truth was made available through politics or religion or philosophy, but these grand narratives have all been found wanting, and nowadays we have to rely on sleuths with a keen sense of smell. Artists are the best trackers that we've got. Art is a secret logic of the imagination which subverts actual worlds in the name of possible worlds. And the artist may not even be aware of what is happening through their work. In certain cases, the artist, he or she, are used as mouthpieces for the psychic secrets of the times in which they live. Art of the future has no template, no guide, no intellectual categories. It feels its way forward, finding words beyond the vocabulary of any language that we currently know how to speak. So, a dialogue must happen between artists and the rest of us. Others do not have the sensitivity, the authenticity, or the flair for capturing the originality that we need. But others do have to build the future, and we are those others. So, in whatever way and to whatever extent is possible, we must become aware of the direction in which the trailblazers are pointing. Now, that doesn't mean that we all have to be artists. It does not mean even that we have to appreciate art ourselves. What it does mean is that someone has to produce the appropriate work of art, and that our socio-cultural ambience has to become infused with the understanding that such art inspires, so that whatever movement we take forward, whatever way we instigate the future, whatever way we're energized or directed, we must be informed by the spirit of that art. That shapes the space which should be cleared for us towards the future. Thank you.
Gromagad Mark, agus Fine Dernach, Oscar and Kushtanov, na Theo Dargan, Philip.
Gromagad a Healy-Rae, agus this Boelum, Thing Vijarigul and Kushtashaw, Éamon Gaeltacht, a flay freshen. Agus Asulung meg an Kushtek toward Kura de Rini eto gaffa felle le Halina na Gaeltacht. Maar da aiben a hen a choshood agus nach winnen beter ook an chorur lenar seher Maralian Tori.
Rivisha. The right to cause Coran Kushta Rivisha.
Right. So, while I'm refreshing, I'd like to say, Chair, that in my written submission, I regret there is a typo on page 9. If you would kindly, in the written submission, change 11 million to 21 million. I recall, for the committee's amusement, that Mr. Yates was once asked how he had spent the day. He said he had spent the morning putting in a comma and the afternoon taking it out. De minimis non curat lex may be true. The law may not care about little things, but poets must. I want to say, first of all, then, that I don't propose to read what I sent as a written submission, because what I hope is a reasonable assumption that some of you will have read it. Because I want to pick up on things that Gary and Philip said in part. I also want to pick up on a previous submission to the committee from the National Campaign for the Arts, which seemed to me to contain, be found in a very accurate, provocative and helpful analysis of what is to be done on the purely practical level in terms of funding the arts. So I don't want to talk about that. What I do want to say, though, is that there is no such thing as the arts. Nobody ever rushed home from work, threw off their clothes, jumped in the shower, dressed again, grabbed a sandwich and a glass of milk and rushed out to the arts. They went to the theatre, or they went to a concert, or they went to a book launch, or they went to the opening of an exhibition. It is really important to understand that art takes distinct forms. Nobody can like everything. One of the difficulties with the way poetry is taught in schools is the poor misfortunes are expected to like everything they see. Now, I have a passion for hurling. I appreciate that football is a kind of a sport in its own way. But to me, passion is about hurling. It doesn't mean that I think we should break the legs of a football team in order to improve the prospects of a hurling team. So we need to start relaxing about this inherited post-colonial idea of the arts as something that all right-thinking people are in favour of, because what follows from that is you do nothing about it. Art is made by individuals and by collectives of individuals who are driven by a passion for a particular form. Some people will cross over backwards and forwards, but that's generally true. In every street, in every estate in this country, in every parish, in every small town, every single street, in every district, there is somebody learning to play an instrument. There is somebody whose most meaningful moments of the day is when they sit down to listen to the music they love. Somebody who wants to go to a theatre. I appreciate what Mark is saying when he talks about the particular native genius of the imagination of the artist. But art is not complete until it meets its audience. And when I make a poem, I send it out into the world and I have no further interest in it. I don't own it. If it lodges in somebody's mind and imagination and means something to them, then the poem is doing its work. Without audience, there is no artist. So when we talk about supporting the arts in Ireland, we are not talking about piously making a small allocation towards a few curious individuals who seem to have inexplicable passions for adding words together, or adding notes together to make a tune, or making lies on a stage in order to tell some kind of truth. We are talking about all of us together. You can't grow a field of wheat by deciding stalk by stalk where to apply your cultivation. You provide for the entire field and you trust chance to see what comes up. But generally, there is a harvest, if we are prudent. The links between culture and agriculture are not accidental. We have to cultivate ourselves, those of us who have the fortune or the misfortune, it may be, to make a life as artists, but also those with whom and for whom and towards whom we make our work. It is absolutely critical to understand that. In the democratic programme, I'll just quote a small piece of it. It says, "It shall be the first duty of the Government of the Republic to make provision for the physical, mental and spiritual well-being of the children." My father worked in a factory. My mother, until she married, worked in a factory. I'm the eldest of a very large family. In the late 1960s, the late Donogh O'Malley went home for the weekend. And he sat there for the weekend and it dawned on him, everybody should have access to secondary education. And he came in on Monday and he called his senior civil servants together and said, we're introducing free secondary education. The folklore is, I'm putting this delicately so as not to cause offence to anybody, pensioned or still in employment, that the civil servants went berserk. They came up with more reasons than Sir Humphrey could imagine about why this could not be done. And when they were finished telling the minister why it could not be done, he told them to go away and do it. Because, you see, his answer to Humpty Dumpty's famous remark, when Alice asked Humpty Dumpty about who was the king, the question about the king, he said, no, he said, the question is who is to be master? And in this democracy, we elect our governments and our representatives, opposition and government at the same time, to be master, to decide on large matters of public policy and to issue the instruction that they be implemented. When the first Dáil convened, all the sensible people laughed. You can go back through the newspaper records, go back through the archives. The people who know, the realists, they thought it was hilarious. A bunch of jumped-up culchies and disaffected petty bourgeois and dodgy trade unionists imagining themselves to be the Parliament of a free Ireland. Well, guess what? It was. It was the first Parliament of a free Ireland and the direct antecedents of the government in which some of you serve and the government some of you hope to be. That was where we started. We imagined ourselves. And it went from there. We imagined a state, which we do not yet have, where all the children of the nation will be cherished. So many thousands of children homeless is not the state we imagine ourselves to be in, but we have to work at it. This committee will make a report to the Minister, who will make submissions to government. What I hope is that your imaginations will be harnessed to this. You have had distinguished submissions from people who know their business and who care passionately about it, who have laboured against all forms of discouragement to open the doors of the imagination to the children of this nation. They have made poems and they have built art centres and they have built world-famous theatres. They have made television series that have gone around the world to the glory of Irish music. And they have done that in the face of what I would call the terrorism of neglect. The truth is, and I hope you will say this in your report, that we have chosen to be poor in the service of the imagination. We have chosen to be poor. We have elected to be poor. This is so much against the grain of who we're supposed to be that there are times, I can tell you, when I have looked in the mirror and asked, are you mad? But I keep going. And Philip keeps singing. And Gary keeps making theatre. Because this is what we do. Now, imagine yourself in that situation and finding that the state that you live in, the people among whom you live, the followers, the children whom you hope will follow your footsteps, are being treated with patronising neglect. I'm sorry to say it, but it is patronising to tell us that Ireland's reputational value leans on its artists, when the vast majority of people who commit their lives to this path are living in abject poverty. And most artists in Ireland are. Now, Humpty Dumpty's point was, it was a very good question. Who is to be master? Master of what? What do we live for in this country? Are we just statistics in an economist's nightmares? Or are we people? Of each other, for each other, by each other, with each other. We go to funerals, we go to weddings. We're together. We go to Croke Park, we go to Thomond Park. We are together. We understand ourselves. Without having to explain it in deep philosophical terms, we understand that we are a people. Well, what kind of people are we when we claim the glories of our artists and treat them so shamefully? The only question that is really important in public life is, who do we want to be? You may imagine that on Easter Monday 1916, you would have objected to the rising, you would have taken part. Now, we can all project ourselves back in history with the benefit of hindsight and say this, that or the other. I take a radical, simple view These were men and women who thought that liberty mattered and that we should be free to imagine ourselves as a free people. And in dribs and drabs, in institutional Ireland, down through the years, we have made faint stabs at that. Well, I think this is a very good moment to ask that question again with absolute seriousness. Who do we want to be? That is a question that can be put in another way. How can we best imagine ourselves in the 21st century? And the 22nd and the 23rd? What foundations are we prepared to lay for who we can be? 1,000 years ago, and this is kind of a popular history, but there's a kernel of truth in it. Ireland was kind of lumen mundi, a light to the world. You take a line from Brest, down through France, through Switzerland, across as far as Slovenia, and you will find Irish place names. What are they based on? They're based on centres of learning from people who their culture, their complex culture at the time, across Europe, at a time when effectively Europe was ruled by economists with hatchets, people who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. We brought, in our very modest way, and I want to stress modest but real way, we brought a light to the world. The current reflexes towards right-wing populism all across the world are spasmodic knee-jerk reactions to globalisation. Globalisation aims to remove what is distinct. It aims to remove things of the mind and heart and soul and to turn us into obedient consumers. It's the logic of the market. There's no point. We should have the strength of character to think of ourselves differently, as people who value the imagination in business, in commerce, in street sweeping, in governance, above all else. I think that this committee has the opportunity to go back to government and say, how much better as a government can you imagine yourselves to be? Can you take responsibility for the depth and wealth of imagination in the Irish people? The child down the street yearning to learn to play the fiddle well enough to be at a Colta session. The young man starstruck at the thought of walking a stage and exercising his imagination by inhabiting invented characters. We have to take responsibility for those. And we have the great good fortune that we can look at practitioners, administrators and artists who have walked this road before us. It is a resource to be tapped into. Only one thing is needed for that to happen: the cultivation of respect, the simple matter of respect. I would like this committee to go to the Minister and propose that the Minister go to government and say, it is time we showed respect for those things we profess to value. We will all be the better for it. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Green Acres television programme. I'm conscious always, when I become passionate about a matter of public import, that I remember that character, I can't remember his name in Green Acres, where he gets entirely carried away. So I hope you don't feel hectored or lectured. It's not my intention. My beloved Paula says to me that if I were a country, the national anthem would be indignation once again. I am, to a certain sense, indignant. I'm indignant that we have such an enormous opportunity to fashion ourselves as a model for the world. But more than that, to create a hospitable environment for the children of the nation. Finally, to show we cherish them. Not by imagining everybody can become an artist, but by offering them the fruits of that work and the practice of creative imagination as an integral part of their formation as citizens and as people. Freely, with no foretold outcomes, no demands. Just here is a gift. We will help to disclose your imagination to you. Go you and make what you will of the future. I think it's such a marvellous opportunity that you have to drive this 100 years on, back into the heart of a democratic programme for the 21st century. I want to end on a slightly dark note. If you go into the RTE archives and you look up in 1966, Mr. Ernest Blythe TD said of the democratic programme, I think that we all thought of it as the hoist of a flag. Nobody ever meant to take it seriously. And Deputy Seán McEntee said, I don't think the working class would have believed in our bona fides, and besides, the farmers wouldn't have stood for it. But wouldn't have stood for what? Cherishing the children, providing for their health, their welfare, mental and spiritual. There is a dark way of looking at this, which is to say the very first Dáil passed a high-sounding programme and then proceeded, fully conscious, to do nothing about it. Well, now, there's a cycle that could usefully be broken. I challenge this committee, in fact. When you produce your report, I don't have to make any argument for why the arts matter. Everybody knows why the arts matter, apart from a handful of journalists who are still infected by post-colonial cringe. We know why the arts matter. My challenge to you is, make it matter. Make a case to government which makes it impossible not to see why it matters and for whom it matters. For the living children and for the children yet to be born. And speaking of children, Mark, you'll forgive me, but there's a child born about 30 seconds ago in the rotunda, and I'd go to that child for a political analysis before I'd go to Bob Geldof. Thank you, Chair. I couldn't resist the sour note. I mean, it's just an opportunity.
Cormagat, Theo, and all four of you for very interesting perspective. Many questions to ourselves. I think you'll find there'll be many questions on this side of the table back at us, and hopefully when we put the report together, that will be many questions not only of the Minister but of politics in general, but society in general, on why the arts matter. So I want to thank you, and now I will open it to members to ask questions. Who's indicating first? Heydon Nagiri. Niamh stuck up her hand first.
Go ahead, get started.
Kieran?
Whichever.
I have to leave to go to the Dáil in a few minutes. First of all, thank you to each and every one of you for your what can only be described as powerfully compelling contributions. My instinctive reaction each time was to clap, but unfortunately I don't think that's allowed in this particular setting.
Stop you.
Thanks, Chairman. Each and every one of your contributions, first of all, I don't know is this possible in terms of what we do within the walls of this House, but I think should be made available, each and every one of them.
Every one will be, all of the written ones will be online at the end of the meeting.
The video, singularly separated and made available as each singularly separate contributions, because I think, you know, there are thousands of people with whom that message we have just heard would resonate deeply with, and many more who could do with having a listen, and perhaps we might make them available. I don't know if that's possible or not. There's this one question I have, and it's in full acknowledgement that we grossly underfund the arts in this country. That's a given as far as I'm concerned. But in doing so, can I ask you a very simple question? And Theo spoke about the rural highways and byways and the estates of this country, and that there's art happening every single day, and that we must create the environment whereby if a young person in their first cultus participation, you know, has the skill and the talent to become a world-class musician, or the first person treading the boards at a one-act drama festival in Roscommon suddenly feels, this is my home, this is my place, this is the place I was meant to be. Do we urgently need to look at the funding structure for arts in this country, as is currently constituted, and an acknowledgement that it is underfunded, but the structure whereby excellence always seems to win out in terms of the largest portion of it. We seek to, at the end of the day, support and acknowledge excellence right at the very top of the pyramid, rather than looking at the highways and byways, rather than looking at the schoolyards, rather than looking at the nascent next coda line, perhaps rehearsing right now in some kid's garage in Limerick. And I think we have, in the vast majority, and I'm referring to our local authorities and our local arts officers, many of whom, some of whom in the west of Ireland I would know pretty well, and I know of their knowledge and particularly of their passion for the nurturing of the arts. And each and every day, well, not every day, but certainly very often, every year, they tell me that they do not have the resources fertilise, to encourage that nascent artistic endeavour, no matter where it occurs in the country. And my question to you is, do we need to invert the pyramid? Should excellence of itself be able to fund itself, and those that are potentially capable of creating excellence in the future be those who are the major recipients of funding when we look at arts funding across the nation? That's my question.
Chair, are you taking all the questions, or are you...
No, because Kieran indicated he had to...
I'd be grateful. And then I'll have to leave. My apologies. But I will read the rest of the contributions as they happen.
So if people wish to respond to what Kieran said.
I think the Deputy has asked a very, very interesting question, and not least because it focuses on how we decide to allocate our resources. The fact is that local authority spending on the arts has decreased year on year. Is now this year it's 27% less than it was last year. I am not convinced that local authorities are, with sufficient passion and sense of service to their communities, committed to funding the arts and developing the arts. The local authorities are perhaps a good place to start with cultivating the beginnings of talent. But Philip and I happened to be on the same Arts Council 2003 to 2008. In fact, it went into 2009. And one of the first questions that we asked was, we're doing a great deal to support emerging artists. What do we do for them when they've taken our encouragement, made the leap of faith, declared themselves as artists, committed themselves to the path, and then we leave them high and dry? So it was a way of focusing on the fact that we must provide for the artists, just the makers themselves to concentrate at the moment, right from the beginning through to end of career. Because it is the voluntary embrace of poverty. I'm sorry to keep harping on this, but that is the material consequence of electing for life as an artist. Some few will be lucky, whether by the zeitgeist or the quality of their talent, it's always impossible to say, and become self-sustaining. And the very fact that you have a small handful of artists who are self-sustaining can often serve to mask the fact and the value of investment right across the board. You see, because at the moment we are enthralled to rather defective economic thinking, we want to know the outcome before we make an investment. The fact is, you can't build a hurling team like that. You can't build a rugby team. You can't build a camogie team like that. You have at some point to make a leap of faith. An investment in the arts is a leap of faith. You can never tell in any one instance that that investment will be returned, but you can say that right across the sector it will be returned. And I mean financially and in all other metrics. So if you're going to fund the arts, you have to do it on a radically democratic basis. You have to make funding as available as possible to the largest number of people and not attempt to secure premature guarantees of the outcome. But you're right in the sense, too, Deputy, that there can be an excessive focus on excellence. But you see, there's a difficult question. If somebody is really good but they're not making a living, but we know they're good and they have an international reputation but they can't afford VHI, as the vast majority of artists cannot afford private health insurance, vast majority. Do you then stop sustaining that person? See, I come back to the field of wheat thing. You must cultivate the whole field. And if some shoots do better than others, well, that's the luck of the draw or genetics or whatever. But practically, one part of my answer to your question is, the imperfect as it is, the Arts Council as an autonomous arts agency, not least because it employs peer review for a lot of considerations in terms of individual artists, is not a bad mechanism, and it has this virtue that at least it is not attempting to produce regime art. It is not attempting to harness prematurely the outcome of a work of artistic creation for the purposes of political propaganda. It makes an act of faith in people's maturity and intelligence and moral probity. So that's a good thing, I think. But it need not necessarily be the only model of support. And I feel that not just in the field of the arts, but in many other areas as well, the powers of local authorities have diminished simply by choking off central funding to those local authorities. It's like going to, do you go to an impersonal bank or your local credit union for a loan? It would be far better, especially for people beginning, or tentative, or not sure, or who intend to become accomplished but remain amateurs in their lives. And I see amateur in its etymology of a lover of something, not somebody less good than a professional. It would be better if you could go local. If your local authority was funding you. If the local authorities had far more funding for scholarships, for funding sessions, for funding schools, for funding every aspect of art support. But that has to come from the central government, because it would require a revolution of a kind none of us here want, to see local authorities wandering around like so many medieval barons, levying their own income as it pleased them. So it comes back to the same question that faces you when you consider state, national level funding for the arts. How much are we prepared to put our political weight behind adequate programmes of funding? The Arts Council has, for many years now, attempted to build partnerships with the local authorities. But the Arts Council isn't in a position to fund the local authorities. And some authorities have done miracles with the funds at their disposal. Others have been quite lethargic. But, how are they to make these decisions without the funding? It's like deciding which child will be allowed to die. If you put them in a position where central funding is perhaps earmarked, I don't know, I haven't thought it through to that level. But if the funding is increased and there is an incentive to develop art support programmes, I think local authorities have a very important role to play.
Go Margaret. Any of the other three want to respond before I turn to the other? Okay, Carcolor. The second person to indicate was Dr. Niamh Smyth, and then I'll take Senator Mary Louise O'Donnell, and then so there'll be two sets of questions, and then back to yourselves.
Well, firstly, to thank you all for your presentations here today. Like the Minister, I did feel like standing up to clap after each and every one. They're so powerful and heartfelt and so emotional, and understandably why too. And you have obviously spent a lifetime contribution in terms of a contribution yourselves to the arts, and that has to be acknowledged too. Myself and Senator Warfield and others perhaps have already spoken with Theatre Forum, and listening to the young artists who are at the beginning of their career, artists who are mid-career as well, and the very practical things that I think is shouldn't be exceptional for us to expect in life. Things like healthcare, things like aspiring to own their own home, things like primary care, things like deciding, I want to start a family, so how does that work being an artist? Things like childcare, how am I going to be able to follow my career in the arts, whether it be as a performing arts, visual artist, all of that. How do I do that as an artist? And of course, as you've spoken about here yourselves too, how we can expect to have a lifetime or long-term security in a career as an artist. Now, you all spoke very eloquently here about, in philosophical terms, if you like, about being an artist and the contribution that it makes to society. And I think we're all won over on that argument. What I'd really like, if you could expand upon, and if I could ask each of our speakers here today to give us 3 practical points of what we can do, what government can do, what we in opposition can do to actually see that the arts can be a career for artists. Because we've talked in very general terms, which has to be talked about, of course. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty and tell us how it can be achieved.
If I can step in, it can be achieved by one simple thing. The government must increase the funding of the arts across the board in this country. It is underfunded. We talk an awful lot about funding the arts, which tends to put the issue down there to something abstract. What you're doing is you're funding your own citizens to make art in your own country. And so many of them now are not. They're leaving and they're making it in other countries for other people. It's about increasing the funding. The Arts Council's annual subvention still hasn't gone back to 2008 levels. We are chronically underfunded. Look at the facts, look at the stats. Per capita, the least of the European Union. A European Union which otherwise in the last couple of months we have proved such worthy members of. It has to be increased. It has to stop being something that's done after everything else is done. It has to stop being at the root of arguments that says, how can you say increase funding to the arts while people are waiting for houses or hospital beds or whatever? It is the life of our citizens that's crucially involved in the arts, and it has to go to the centre of the government's thinking in relation to the kind of country we want our citizens to live in. So simple.
I would absolutely Chair, agree with that. I mean, it is a national resource, is what we're talking about here. And like any national resource, you can't open cast mine this resource and dig it all out and put nothing back in. And I mean, it's nuts to operate in that fashion. And everybody here has alluded to the fact that the arts are valuable. Gary spoke very eloquently in Dublin Castle recently at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade get together, talking about 100 years of the diplomatic service and Ireland 2025, where we want to increase our influence and our global footprint. It is a statement of intent by the government. How do we make ourselves audible? How do we make ourselves visible? If we're not audible and visible, we won't be considerable, and we won't be a consideration. And again, on the STEM front, the science, technology, engineering and maths, and the assertion of A into that, and all across government, an all-government approach, which, I mean, I spoke to somebody from tourism, and we were talking about some project that I was doing, and it was how many bed nights would be in that. Right. So it was, the yardstick by which things got judged, was a granular outcome, and public money absolutely, justifying the investment. But that's not replenishing a resource. I mean, finance needs to talk to arts needs to talk to DFA. Everybody needs to talk to each other and come out of this siloed mentality of so that's the arts crowd over there. It has gone beyond that, and as I did allude to in my remarks a little earlier on, I mean, I passionately believe that that we have just a significant national resource which is not minded, is not husbanded, is not tended. I mean, we talk about the human dimension of that, and you've alluded to that about healthcare, all the usual things that every citizen has a right to. But we are making a hugely valuable contribution in a world that I keep saying is more digital, more virtual, more artificial, and it is a national resource for us that puts us on the map and makes us audible, visible and considerable. And if we do not invest in it, I mean, it's criminal. It is shameful if we do not invest in this resource. And you, as our representatives, must take that message to the heart of government. You must do that. And you're not doing it for us. We're talking about identity. We're talking about how we are viewed, how we are seen, what the value proposition is for an Ireland of the 21st century.
Interrupt you. When yourself and Theo were on the Arts Council, and you did ask a very important question, when an artist, an emerging artist, does make that decision to be an artist and to make that commitment, which is a lifelong commitment, as you know, what conclusion did you come to in terms of what provisions we should be making to ensure that when artists do make that decision, that there is a lifelong career for them?
I mean, I think Gary alluded to it. And I didn't more than alluded to it, just spoke very, very clearly. It's very simple. You need to increase the funding of the arts in Ireland significantly, so as that an artist can have a sustainable career in their chosen profession.
I mean, it is one thing to be young and to start a theatre company, as I did with my colleagues, is one thing to be 25, 26, 27 and wanting to be an actor. By the way, the rate of people who stop being professional actors because they're simply not able to make even the most fundamental, rudimentary livings out of it is huge. The exit from the profession is huge. You just don't decide it and survive out of it. But what happens then when suddenly you marry, or you have responsibilities, or you have aging parents, or you become sick, or you become unwell? I am, like almost every day, I am disturbed by seeing so many actors that I knew as young people in states of enthusiasm and delight at being actors, and now literally not having had pensions, having had health care, and facing into lives of real poverty. These are actors who work, not just actors who don't work. These are important people who actually helped found theatres in this country. Names who you around this table would recognise. There are people who are well-known names to you who are finding it hard to put 2 pennies together to fund their lives and the lives of their children.
Can I just tease that out a little bit more, Gary? Theatre Forum, again, in some of their analysis and that, however, there was, I suppose, a feeling, however, that for artists now it's become more competitive. There are a lot more artists, you could argue, in our country because we've got third-level colleges like NCAD, like Dunleary, like Limerick, like Cork that are, you know, significant numbers of students, graduates every year. They go on to do postgraduates, they go on to do masters and perhaps doctors. In terms of, okay, supposing tomorrow morning there's double the amount of the funding in the arts, okay? How do you resolve the problem in terms of ensuring that our arts still have more security? I'm really trying to get, is there any other practical measures you have in mind? Like, I accept, definitely, we all would agree there has to be a greater investment in the arts, okay? So we get that done, we get that into the Arts Council. So then how do we ensure that that actually gets to the artists and that they have that security?
You don't allow a situation, for instance, whereby any organisation which is funded by any part of the government can pay less than the minimum wage, even to people who want to work for it because they so want to get on. You create a situation where the health of the sector is always in view, that you don't have people at the age of 40 who turn around and say, I know I need private health care, but I can't afford it. You actually sit down and think about it. The various stakeholder bodies like the Arts Council, so on and so forth, all of us in the industry are required. You don't have a situation where 312 members of the theatrical profession signed a letter that went to the Times last week that said they're being cast adrift. That's huge. And that is an easily ordered thing, but it would need increased real spending on the arts by government, and that the government is currently not doing.
Senator Marty Louise, I come back just, there is 3 others who are trying to get in.
Well, first of all,
Chair, could I also contribute an answer to the deputy's question?
The same comments will be coming up, I'd say. So
well, if you wish, Chair, as you wish.
I'm just trying to make sure we have the slot only for limited time. I'd love to sit here all day, but there are 3, and then we can come back.
I just want to say thank you very much, and it's a real privilege to be here today. I was told not to come on this committee because I was told there was no votes in it, which is very telling, and it's my first round of time on the Arts Committee, which raises another question, because this committee used to be Arts and Sport, then it became Arts and Tourism, then it became Culture, Heritage and Gaeltacht, that we refuse also within the arts, within the performance, to actually name the cats. We will not name what we're speaking about. So it's become globalised and amalgamated into some kind of thing now called culture. Nothing wrong with culture, nothing wrong with heritage, nothing wrong with the Gaeltacht, nothing wrong with sport, and nothing wrong with tourism, except we sometimes have our eye on tourism. You see, arts is all right if it's to do with tourism, or it's all right to do with the economy. On its own, not too sure. Not too sure, no. Can't stand as an independent cat. You know, that with a department, and we lost out on that, first of all, politically, that it's not an independent cat sitting there with all its, radii of its own circle, not attached to something here, there and everywhere. It was interesting, Philip, that at the celebration the other day, the thing that moved the audience, and you could hear a pin drop, was the Coolin played on the violin and O'Carolan played on the harp. It just brought everybody right back to their stomach, which raises another point, that arts or the expressive arts, creativity, imagination is important regardless of whether you take it up or not. You know, as a performer, it's important for well-being and for not feeling useless. I mean, even I wrote a study on bereavement and death in Ireland, you know, dying in Ireland, whether we do it well. We do it ritualistically well, but we not necessarily don't, we're not good around grief sometimes. But it was the arts people turned to all the time for the language of grief, you know, to go somewhere, you know, when their life became meaningless or valueless. And you'll see that with young people, not necessarily as a performer, but somewhere to fill up. One of the things that I think is very neglected here is that we have a politics here that says it is all right to give 25 points to mathematics in the Leaving Certificate, but it's not all right to do it to a passion, an imaginative passion or creativity, like visual arts, like dance, like theatre, like literature, like poetry, like a spoken art, which is completely neglected, or like music. We don't think that's a good thing. It would be a good place to start to allow young people actually find a way through communication. So we're fighting the hedges here. We're fighting hedges here, and we're fighting birds, and we're fighting... No, we shouldn't be fighting those things in the environment, even on this committee, because we won't name the cat. We won't... That's the first thing we should do, is restore the performing arts, the expressive arts, creativity and imagination of that radii to its own department, and it makes its own decisions, and it's not Vegasing around on trying to balance. And that's the first thing that we should try and do. I could go on about the full meaning of imagination. I could go on about Palestine. I could go on about how the arts is above politics and, you know, above territory and above the Kalashnikov. You know, if we could replace the Kalashnikov with the expressive arts, if you look at the West East Divan Orchestra of Barabon, if you look at L'estima, if you look at Sing Out with Strings, when I think of the way the performing arts have elevated people in the worst possible situations, it's the only way through sometimes when politics has completely let it down. The other thing, I rarely see in Europe, in front of the flags, the Commissioner for Arts or the Commissioner for Culture or Heritage standing there batting. It's always the bloody economist or the banker who's out, or the insurance boy who's out telling us how the things should be, you know, in front of the big waving flags in Europe. We need greater speakers, and whether the government appoints them from people like yourselves or points them internally, we need greater speakers on or greater vocality about it. And the last thing, I would like to ask, well, what your opinions on what I've said, but also the National Theatre. One of the problems, I think, with the National Theatre, which is cardiograph, as you say, Mark Patrick, a pulse, and it's lost that pulse or that rhythm of that pulse. Is that because we have no training school there, that we lost all that? What's wrong there, and what can we do, without being political, what can we do to fix that? And do you think the Arts Council is vocal enough? I know it's, that's not a political question as well. It's the, do you think that we're not being vocal enough? Also, I would believe that every department, I saw this on Dying, Death and Bereavement, where people thought it had only to do with health, when it had to do with travel, when it had to do with the arts, when it had to do with education, when it was across the whole departments, that maybe every department, every minister should have a fool, you know, like in Lear, be able to tell them, excuse me, that's not the right way to go, you know, or that we should have an artist sitting in every department, and that artist say there is a way forward here, there's a communication level here. But my basic point is that we must go back to having an independent arts, creative arts, whatever you want to call it, department that is not a part of something else. That's the first thing. We must make the arts, music, drama, theatre, poetry, dance, spoken art, a subject and discipline, call it a discipline, capable of its own independence within education and its own passion within the Leaving Certificate point system, so people can do it for self as well as for practicality. So I kind of made a speech because I'm so delighted to have you here. And it's so, one of the things about the arts, always did for me anyway, I always felt the word elevation was around it, you know, joy. And if I was looking for the truth now, I won't go to the press, and I wouldn't go to the TV, and I won't go to the radio. I won't go to politics. I'll go and watch theatre, or I listen to a piece of music, or I'll read a poem, or I listen to Mark Patrick Hederman, what he had to say, because I'm elevated. I'm brought somewhere, both with pain and joy. But there's a truth in what's being said, and that's, I think, what we're missing out in.
Gordon Walcott, who wants to start? Theo, you were in the case.
Sure, I rather like Senator O'Donnell's idea of that we should have a Ministry of the National Imagination. I think it wouldn't be, but I can just see the reaction in some quarters in Dáil and the announcement that we are going to have a Minister for the Imagination. But in substance, of course, Senator, I agree with you completely. I'd like to go back for a moment to Deputy Smith's question on practicalities. I think the committee would hardly expect us to come up with a programme of investment and a blueprint for how money is to be spent. I would say this, Deputy, that the crucial change that's needed is to shift from a mindset that money is given to the arts or granted to the arts, and a firm understanding, an unshakable understanding that we're talking about investment. If the collectivity of arts activity in this country were to be brought together under a shareholder's offering and offered on the market, as it were, as a business, I think you'd be beating off investors. I mean, I agree with Philip that when the Indicon report came out, everybody thought, here comes salvation. They didn't reckon with the Department of Finance and the department's absolute inability to grasp the concept of investment. Now, the way it works out is, in 1968, if the Arts Council grant in aid was 68 million, 47 million came back directly from arts organisations funded from that 68 in PAYE, PRSI and VAT. The return to the economy from the 21 million, which was the actual investment, was 147 million. That's directly attributable to those organisations which were run. Now, if I give you €21, you give me €21, which would be much better, and at the end of the year I give you 147 back, is it not the height of foolishness to give me 19 next year? I mean, you know, if the situation was reversed, I'd give you 42 the following year if I had it to give it to you. We need to understand that this is investment in an enormous collectivity of entrepreneurs. We fetishise the quality of the entrepreneur here. But in fact, every artist, every theatre company, every art centre is an entrepreneurial enterprise. But I want to turn back again from the idea that we want to somehow emphasise the special position or the special privileges or the notional privileges of the individual artist. I want to look at all of us. The population of our republic is 8,000 people short of the population of Metro Boston. You know, the metropolitan area of Boston, USA, is 4.6 million. We're something like 4.68, I think, at the moment. There is no comparison between the reputational value accruing to the state of Ireland from the work of its artists to what comes out of Boston. No harm to the committee or to ourselves either, but I can't, right off the top of my head, think of a world figure out of Boston. And I could keep us here all day talking about the quality of Irish artists of considerable world achievement. So I don't think we should be asked to demonstrate any longer the value of what we do. I don't even think we should be going cap in hand, as it were, saying, give us a dig out, give us more to do what we do better. I think we should turn the question around and ask, who do we want to be as a proud people?
Yes.
What do we do in the 21st century for meaning? As we become a post-religious culture, as we become a polyvalent culture, with people from all over the world joining us in citizenship and bringing the streams of their inheritances to bear. And there, I can tell you, there is a generation of new Irish poets coming through who are going to just blow your minds. I'm beginning to see those seeds coming through. So this is a new Ireland. This is a country with a proud history, but a shameful reputation in being proud of itself and in cherishing each other. That's true. It's a shame. There are deep elements of shame in how we treat many of our citizens. But we don't have to be like that. 100 years ago, who would have said that the little island of Ireland could set in train the dissolution of the biggest empire the world had ever seen? You would have been told you were insane even to think about it, but we imagined it otherwise. So that's my recurrent question. If we can imagine ourselves bigger, better, more filled with right pride, not grandiosity, but actual pride in ourselves and in each other, what would we not do for each other if that were the case? This will involve material resources, but it involves also a commitment to changing a mindset which says we don't believe in supporting the arts in schools. Who's this we? The people of Ireland do. So I ask, who's making the decisions? If you go into a secondary school in this country and ask people, which would you rather, economics or music? Guess what the answer would be? We all know what the answer would be. So there's a disconnect here between what the people who grant government its authority want and what government, once in place, decides it may have. We have to begin to dissolve that boundary. And we need to do it as a matter of urgency. Because if we don't, if the economists get too used to being in the saddle, then God help us all.
Again, just one comment to that. I look at Science Foundation Ireland and I ask myself, how is Science Foundation Ireland funded? Who funds it? And look at the quantum of money that Science Foundation Ireland gets and then compare that to the national resource and the investment in the arts. What's going on?
Philip, is how do we feed the imaginations of our scientists?
That's right. And the Society of Engineers came out recently and sort of said we're producing great mathematicians, very good engineers, but they've no empathy. They can't talk. They can't talk to you. They can't engage with you. You know, I mean, just one thing struck me. We took the Other Voices thing. We were invited to take Other Voices to Austin in Texas, and the people who came to Dingle to look at it said, "Bring this over to Austin." And I said, Willie Nelson has a studio in Austin. He said, "We'll work with him, and we'll work with. It'll be fantastic." And I said, "Why do you want us to go to Austin? Right? There's more music in Austin than you could shake a stick at, right?" And the guy said, "Because it enhances the value proposition of our town." Right? Now, the motto in Austin is, "Keep Austin weird." Right? Right? No, that is their motto. And I said to the guy, I said, "What's that about?" He said, "We keep the music at the heart of our town. Right? We like to attract creative, interesting people who can develop intellectual property and new stuff. And people then around the United States, we set up the town like this. It's a cool place to live. It's a blue dot in a red state, and it's got great music, it's got great food, and all these techie guys who like to work in the middle of the night, who are dreaming up this, that and the other, say, you know what, I'm going to go live in Austin." And they clustered around the lifestyle of the place itself. And of course, we're looking a gift horse in the mouth with that one. We've got it. You know, we don't even have to make it up. We don't have to go to a marketing company, or we don't have to go to an advertising agency, or what are they called now, creative agency. We are a creative agency. And as Fintan O'Toole said in Dublin Castle, power. We've got soft power. It's the only power we have. It's soft power. And it's very, very, very effective. And I'll go back to my 3 words, audible, visible. And if we're audible and visible, we become considerable and a consideration. And so the guys in Austin, who have great music, said, "That's why we want you here, because it's cool. And we like what you do. So bring that thing over here."
Chair, I can offer you an anecdote which supplies an answer to Deputy Smith's question again. Just in 2001, in the Golden State University in San Francisco, they had a Festival of Irish Writing, organised by the Consul General there. And he turned, after the first session, he turned to me and he said, "There are 22 CEOs of Silicon Valley companies there in the audience that we have been trying to get meetings with for 6 months. They couldn't get meetings with them for 6 months, but they all turned up to hear poets and novelists speak. One of the people present there was Chelsea Clinton. And Chelsea was there because she was then a student of the poet Evan Boland, who has done so much to open access to poetry for Irish women. And I'd just edited an anthology of Irish poetry just before then. I gave a copy to Chelsea. And 2 days later, I'm in the Kennedy Centre in Washington because I was presenting a programme of Irish writers. And Jean Kennedy Smith says, "You know that book you gave to Chelsea? Yeah, it's on Bill's desk." In one weekend, drawn purely by the arts, you have a presence on the desk of the President of the United States. You have 22 CEOs of Silicon Valley companies. And I came away, and I remember saying to the ambassador in Washington, every Enterprise Ireland delegation that comes out here should have as the keynote of its mission an arts event, a performance of a play, a concert of music, a poetry reading. They should harness what Philip Apley calls soft power and work in conjunction. Senator said that these departments should be working together. Of course they should. There should be no trade delegation anywhere in the world that is not linked to a high-profile cultural event. It's a very simple proposition. Trust me, it works. When President Higgins went on a state visit to China and he presented the President of China with an edition of W.E. Yeats's poems translated into Chinese, the man took his 2 arms in his 2 hands and said, "This is the most meaningful gift we have ever been given. We have ever been given by a head of state." When President Higgins made a state visit to Athens in February, the presentation was beautifully printed by Stony Road Press, and 2 of his poems translated into Greek. That was his gift to the President of Greece, who, and I was there, had tears in his eyes and said, "This means so much." We need to be aware. We need to be aware of just how powerful our cultural presence is abroad. What are we known for? The excellent management of our banks, our superiority in providing health services and housing to our people. The only thing we're known for is true and performance of our rugby team, but not, alas, of the soccer team. But what are we known for in the world? What is our footprint in the world? Our culture. How insane not to invest in that.
Gary, and then...
Yeah, can I just make exactly the same point as the previous speakers? If you look at even just one small thing, Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, we made that piece of theatre 2 years ago. It played in our own theatre in Galway, which seats 100 people. It played for 2 weeks. Luckily, it wasn't enough. Everybody else wanted to see it. The maths of making that made no sense whatsoever. It cost a subsidy of 40 to 50 per seat for Irish people to see it. If that's where it had ended, that is just a display for you of why subsidy is required in the making of theatre. But that's where it didn't end. And its last performances were at the Lincoln Centre to 700 or 800 audiences who were all guests of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and they were heads of mission from all around the world to the UN, and they were there as part of the process whereby the department is attempting to gain a seat on the UN. So it's precisely the same point. And just very quickly to reply to the Senator's response about the problems at the Abbey, I've got to say that it's a problem that I'm unfortunately only too aware of, having been artistic director there over 30 years ago now at this point. I think essentially, and I have thought long about this both in terms of my own time there and in subsequent, I think it's a problem of governance. I think the board of the Abbey has to lay down a narrative and agree a role and purpose and function with the major stakeholders, including the Minister and including the Arts Council and various other bodies. I think then, once that is done, this is then the context in which the artistic directors are appointable and to which they are held accountable. I think that's crucial. It's what is the Abbey for? I also think that the Abbey, in as much as the Film Board and so on and so forth, has sectoral responsibilities, and I think this is why that letter was such a bombshell last week. It has sectoral responsibilities, as it receives 50% of performing arts funding in this country, in that it has sectoral responsibilities in terms of training, in terms of development, in terms of health, in terms of what it pays people, over and above those other organisations, and that has to be part of the narrative of governance of the organisation.
Senator Alice Marie Higgins.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank you, Chair, for allowing me to join the committee. It's not my usual committee, so thank you very much to the members for accommodating me. I want to thank people for their presentations, which are wonderful, and for the work that you do all of the time. And I just wanted to pick up almost in one kind of bigger picture piece and then a couple of more specifics. I think the analogy that was being given in terms of agriculture could perhaps even be built on further if we looked past agriculture into the ecosystem. So when we think about the arts, I think it is very important very often that we're not focusing simply on the predictable crop or the predictable outcome, and we're not focusing on, the tallest tree in the forest or even the one with the sweetest fruit, because it may well be that excellence may not be in a form that is going to be financially rewarded or even politically or socially welcomed. It will take this one, but that recognising all of those parts, and I think it was described very eloquently in terms of the experiences of every person who touches in on an exhibit or sends a picture in their classroom or goes to a show or is moved by something somewhere or reads something that's written on a bench, whatever it is, but all of the full picture of the community that creates an ecosystem of creativity and of imagination and of culture, and of course that the dividends for that are immense, not simply, and it's so hard to understand. That's the one thing I would quibble with the idea of the entrepreneurs, because that's can be very isolated, but what we need to see is the benefit comes up elsewhere so often, and we know the huge dividends, as a financial, that have been described from the arts. We know it in areas like tourism, and I think it's an interesting flip of the bed night analogy. We might have seen Proposition E that passed recently in San Francisco, where there was in fact a levy on bed nights, which was put into a general fund for public art, because it recognised that the environment created by the art in the city was something that generally created an environment which people visited. It was an interesting, even though I know we need direct central funding as well as that kind of levy. But it also comes out in science, in creative thinking, in relationships, in the difficult conversations. When we looked at things like the Magdalene laundries and so many of the really tough issues which only came through and were faced and confronted through the arts. And it does make for better politics. I think it was very eloquently spoken about the power and the huge impact Ireland has internationally in terms of the arts, and how we have made our mark and how much that is, and both in our founding moments and then in how we present to the world. But it's also important to recognise that power is recognised in the inverse as well, because we've seen that in situations which we have around the world again now, of bad politics, of the rise of authoritarianism, that we see the arts are one of the first things restricted. I think it was in the last dictatorship in Brazil, the first thing banned was this little instrument based on a turtle shell, which was used in as a folk instrument. And now we see Paulo Freire and Boal and others, again, very much that theatre of the oppressed, as part of what is targeted by those who wish to curtail the imagination. And I think the arts, at this particular time, when there's very heavy resources being addressed into a narrowing of perspectives and the cultivation of fear, the kind of connections that can be made rather than divisions, and connections that are challenging by the arts, is immensely important and is globally necessary and something we can do. I want to just finish though with a very practical piece. Like others, I've come from Theatre Forum. Just today was actually, that's why I was late, speaking with them at their annual meeting. And we do see, I was put in mind of the, is it Pirandello's The 6 Characters in Search of an Author, whereas this idea, sometimes actors get treated and performers get treated almost like the character, that artists come into this glorious bloom when we need them for special occasions, and then the people kind of disappear in between. And I think much as we've described the importance of arts for a full humanity, for our society, similarly the full human lives of artists does need to be recognised. And I think it's something, about an increase in funding, as was said I think very clearly, but it is also around how that funding is. And I do think there's something to be said for looking at how we do our procurement and our contractual things, that employment is factored in a strong way from the beginning. There is no reward for that. And I think local authority funding was mentioned, the centres and venues that are such a resource, to be resourced further, to be real employers and sustained employers. I think if you could just comment around that piece of that, how we build in, and progression. Because the fact is, for artists in Ireland, they move between employers so often. How does that chart so that you are moving up, rather than starting again with each new scheme and each new project, but that there is progression being built in, and a pay scale that works, for example, across whole sectors, rather than just within one institution. And my last thing just around that and the progression of the venues, investment in arts, is social protection. Because I know there's controversy on the scheme. I'm on the Social Protection Committee, that's my committee. I'll be looking to the report from this committee and bringing it through to say, because I think within the social protection system there's a deep lack of understanding of what it is to craft a life in the arts. And I think a relationship that can be quite punitive, and a relationship of kind of fear and scrutiny for artists in that, how they relate with that. Again, social protection system not being a safety net or a reward or a handout, but rather a recognition of the contribution everybody makes, and one of our mechanisms of redistribution for the public good. So maybe perhaps if you had thoughts on that we could bring back to my committee, but I know that there's not much time, so I'm happy to follow up separately with you on that.
Answer very briefly. I think that how you've, Senator, how you've articulated is incredibly pertinent. I think that we are so used to the thinking around the arts being, well, they will do that anyhow, and sure, they love doing what they're doing, and it's not really work. And the arts are about passion and all of those kind of things. That sense of that it's something other is at the heart of the thinking about financing the arts. And I think the questions you are asking are very real, and we should address them in every possible way we can, both in our own work, which I hope we're doing, but also as part of the various fora, and through make various organisations like the Arts Council and so on say, this is critical. It's not critical that it is critical perhaps that you make an art that we think you should be making, in the sense of making art for children, or making it for people who are live in remote areas, which, for instance, Druid does. But it's also critical that we are funding you so that the individual actor, maker of art, does not suffer. We are going to have to stop talking all the time about the arts and talking more about the artists.
And just as others answer, I just want to add a single other tap-on question, which is perhaps if you could comment around the economic, the social and maybe artistic cost as well, if we get a diversity of voices pushed out, because only some can afford, either those who are older end up leaving, those who have children end up leaving, and so forth. Yeah. Perhaps.
Just two comments, Senator. When you talked about the political situation in the world at the moment, and I've just hearing more and more that as let's say the habits of partnership that we have, like with our nearest neighbours, become strained and a bit more adversarial. That pipeline of cultural diplomacy between over and back, us working together, is a very, very useful and powerful way of continuing a real human engagement in those times of stress. And then just to your point as well, you know, there's a significant capital budget at the Department of Arts, as I understand it, and you know, buildings need to be maintained, national cultural institutions need to be maintained, but artists don't live in those places. Their work lives in those places, sometimes when they're dead. We need to look after the humans. You know, the capital side is necessary, but the other side of the column is absolutely essential, because without that, there isn't any art to put into these places.
Senator Warfield.
Cheers. I would just take you up on that point straight away. I was going to ask, the Arts Act allows for the Arts Council to have a legislative responsibility in acquiring and whatever land and property. Do you think that's a conversation we need to have, public housing, that the Arts Council could be involved in that conversation?
I think, yes, I do.
Music and performance is my counter to life in here. If I've had a lousy day, or if I'm in tears or whatever, I'll just go home and lash it out on the guitar, as I always, or sing or whatever, as I always have done. And I'd probably die without it. The difference is that if I was still working on the road, I'd either have moved to America or I'd be still living at home. So that's the benefit, I suppose, of working in here on a good wage compared to friends who live at home. So housing is, I just can't separate the arts from, and the struggle of artists from housing in this city. I wanted to make a point on the local authorities. I think local authorities should have a bigger role. At the moment, it's a similar budget to the Arts Council as a whole. If you count up the spend across all local authorities, the disparity in spend is troubling, and it ranges from €18 per head of population to 50 cents per head, and I think there's inequalities that need to be addressed there. And I don't see it as a threat to Arts Council funding. Do you think like this neoliberal kind of mindset means, you know, CSO statistics last year said that artists were earning 3.5% less in Q1 of 2018 than in 2013. And in 2013, Arts Council funding was 60 million. So you could throw loads of money. You throw 25% more money at the Arts Council or local authorities, but wages might not go up. So I think the conversation around the Abbey should be a trigger. And I know where the state is involved, that we should expect the highest standards. And that's what I took from what you said, Gary. But I struggle to think that wages will go up unless we make interventions on wages alone. I wanted to get into just the nitty-gritty of some art forms, two of which I know, film from studying in GMIT and music from life in general. And it was funny you said, you mentioned Austin, that they wanted to keep the music at the heart of the town. I was at an event the other night by a campaign called Give Us the Night, and it's a campaign around licensing laws, around venues. We don't have all of it, particularly queer spaces where I would dance. They're closing, hotels are being thrown up, Hard Rock cafes here, opening next year. So we're losing places to dance. And they approached the Minister for Culture and tried to make a case around the culture of the night, you know. They were told, that's not our response.
That's not nice.
You have to go to justice for that. That's a justice issue.
With a red lamp.
The fire of joy, yeah.
And so, yeah, there's some of the campaign ideas were around staggered opening hours, closing times, places to go, transport home, public transport home. But it got me thinking around a different idea that we have, and IMRO have called for it for some time actually, around a music strategy for Ireland. And I think it's something to run with now, because by the time Creative Ireland has kind of has had its day come 2022, I think we should have certain strategies in place and I think a music strategy is one of them, and I'd be reluctant to get involved in art forms specifically, and that the Arts Council should play that role, but I think music has its place in all of our art forms. And I just wondered, Philip, where do you see the sector, the music industry, emerging artists? Do you think there's a need for a music office where, as a one-stop shop for young or emerging artists? Where do you see the infrastructure of music, and royalties online as well is obviously a huge thing. Spotify is good compared to YouTube. Would you be waiting?
I mean, the model of the music industry at the moment is a very difficult model for any artist and for anybody creating intellectual property. On the one hand, very large record companies, say like Universal, if they're signing an artist, they'd sign them to what they call a 360 deal, which means that they will take their publishing, they will advance some money, which is like a loan, in return for the recording rights, in return for the publishing rights, but they also then will attach income, gigging income, on a 360 deal, because they deem that by promoting the artist they have made them commercially viable, and they want a kickback from your gig receipts. When I started out in music, what you did was you released a record and then you went on the road to promote the record. Now what you do is it's entirely the other way around. You put out a record so as that you promote the tour, and that your only income is from those places. It's a very, very difficult world, and I mean there are various different organisations that do extremely good work. It would be very good if they all came together. I mean, what we do with the Other Voices model, really, its mission is to celebrate what's about to happen. It's to give a platform to the generation of musicians that will be the musicians of the future. So if Hosier does his first gig in Dingle, his first television gig, that sort of thing. And our dedication is to that, and is to finding a platform to make that happen, and to make them, these artists, again, to use the phrase, audible and visible. The Arts Council itself, when Theo and I were on it, and didn't recognise traditional music as an art form, and we worked very hard to put what we call the traditional arts as a line item in the Arts Council's budget. They don't recognise rock and roll either, so it's quite odd. So when you're going looking for funding as an artist and you go to the Arts Council, there's no subhead under which you can go as a rock and roll head and say, this is what I do. And they say, well, actually, we've no box for that. I mean, that's nuts. I mean, when you think about it, really.
Well, it's not only, if I may say, Chair, if I may just add to what Philip is saying, it's not only that the Arts Council doesn't have a popular music officer. Once upon a time they had, and then they let it drop. I chaired the Policy and Strategy Subcommittee of that particular council, and I attempted to bring the council to adopt a policy on popular music. You remember this? It was resisted tooth and nail. I was driven to bringing in 2 CDs and playing a Joni Mitchell song and a Schubert lead, and pointing out that music, from a musicological point of view, the Joni Mitchell song was more sophisticated and more complex than the Schubert.
Not art, though.
There is always a tendency, and it has been reinforced at state level, to take a middlebrow attitude to the arts. I mean, our Arts Council wouldn't have given a bursary to Van Morrison or Bob Dylan. I mean, that's an absurd state of affairs. So if the Minister, following from this report, were to suggest very gently, but with a big stick half hidden behind her back, that it would be a very good idea for the Arts Council to start supporting popular music, I think it would achieve 2 things. It would signal to the people that the music which people are most interested in is being invested in and supported at state level, and it would also help to open up the minds of professional arts practitioners to the idea we are a broad church. Yeah. Everything we do in pursuit of meaning is part of culture, and I think that's the message. People want meaning in their lives, and where do they go for it? They go to art forms, not to the arts, not that generalisation. They go to music, theatre, film, books, the art of conversation, for God's sake. This is what we want. I want to, Chair, if I'm just make one last reference to the democratic programme. The democratic programme refers to securing the permanence of government in the willing adhesion of the people. It has been my experience at 65 years of age that the level of trust in government is dwindling on a year-by-year basis. And why? Because I think successive governments and the instruments of government and the instruments of the state have begun to define the state as their property. And there has been a sliding away from the idea that those who sit in Shannon and those who sit in Dáil and those who inhabit the upper reaches of the public service are at the service of the people. This is not an abstract concept when it comes to the arts. When people decide not to teach the arts or not to promote the arts in school, they are going against the express interests and wishes of the people. I do not think the state has that right. I think it has a duty, conversely, to ask the people what they want and to arrange to give it to them. The idea that somebody somewhere in a committee knows what's best for us is, quite frankly, beyond offensive. We know what we want and what the Irish people want when they've finished paying their tithes to Mammon and selling their time, a considerable portion of their lives, in order to feed and clothe and shelter themselves. What they want is music. What they want is theatre, what they want is sport, what they want are things that give passion and excitement and a release to their imaginations. And I actually think it's not for the state to deliberate and decide whether it will grant us this. The state has a responsibility to answer to that imperative if it is to continue to secure the willing adhesion of the people. Let's not fetishise the democratic programme. Let's listen to what it says and let's do something concrete about implementing it.
Just very briefly, and then I will ask a few questions.
You'll be happy to know, Theo, that I would consider myself very much a conduit of expertise across from me here. That's one of the advantages of the committees, you know, that's where you really hear the truth about what's going on. You won't hear it in the Shannon floor because you don't hear it a lot of the time from government because there's a certain way of thinking and it's very difficult to get through that stew. And as an independent, it's even more difficult. I was just wanted to make one comment. I was very interested in what Senator Higgins said about the environment, because it is such a part to play, because I actually think that people have no expectation of beauty now. You know, they don't really have it around themselves. They don't expect there to be a tree on their street. You know, they don't expect, you know, architecture has gone kind of crazy. But I did want to ask, finally, if either of you were there and were the Minister of Art. I like the word arts in the sense that I think of it in a different way. I think about music, art, poetry, drama, literature, dance. I think of it in those terms. What was the first radical thing you'd do? If you had that opportunity, the year of magical thinking, but if you had that opportunity, what is the most, leaving out and understand all the social welfare aspects of things and people having, as Gary said, thinking of the artists, not the building, you know, the artists coming first. Because we do preserve buildings before people. But what's the most radical, Mark? Can I just ask our four guests that you might do, if you had that, you were the Minister of an independent department, which I think is the first place we should go, what's the first radical thing you would do? Or suggest?
Just to lighten the atmosphere a little around here, I would begin each session of the Shannon and Dáil with a poem and conclude it with a piece of original composed music.
Very good.
Do any thoughts?
Well, instead of being a siloed department, isolated, called the Department of Arts, I think it would be absolutely essential that there would be buy-in across government that would be inter and intra-departmental, and that the senior civil servants in each of the significant departments that would come together, and that a policy to strategically fund the arts correctly, as we've alluded to over the last couple of hours, would be pulled together and would have the weight of all of that. You know, so being in isolation is no good. And
being tagged on to other departments is no good.
So you need to open up that box, and you need to go to the cabinet secretary, you need to go to the Department of Foreign Affairs, you need to go to all of those departments that have an interest in realising the advantages and the strategic application of a functioning arts sector in Ireland and what it can do for us, and invest correctly in it like you do with anything else.
Okay.
I'm not going to repeat again what you've said. I think that's absolutely right. And, you know, it's almost in the same vein that every single department in government should be forced to be part of the thinking and deliberation of the department, which is a department for the arts, to stop this silo mentality that somehow or other the arts are something out there that other people do for other people that we don't know.
And we better give them a bit of something.
A bit of something to make us look half civilised.
Mark, Will.
I got the impression from Deputy Smyth that the question was, even if we doubled the amount of money that was being given to artists, or whatever we want to call it, how would that be filtered? Because the problem I see is that nearly every single person in Ireland regards themselves as an artist. That everybody has a sheaf of poems and everybody has a novel they're going to write, and everybody, that's a great thing about Ireland. But it does mean that you have to decide whether everybody is going to get a coupon, or we're going to give everybody some kind of amount of money to develop that. So really, how do you filter it? How do you actually distribute that money? And I think if we're going to reform the Senate, as we have been describing for a long time now, that there should be always on the Senate appointments from Éamon, that the artists there should be on the Senate as artists and therefore have a say in what's happening at government level. And then the first thing I would do if I had the opportunity would be reform the leaving certificate examination and try and make it develop some kind of creativity rather than having everything to do with memory. We don't need memory when we have Google.
Okay, I have a few questions myself.
You're so generous.
Chair, have we not?
No,
very generous chair.
It's the type of debate
Yeah.
that if I was to impose the normal rules of debate in this House, you wouldn't have the exchange and we wouldn't have the benefit of the exchanges we've had, which I think will be very useful in putting together our report. Two pieces of information which you might enjoy, but also the members should take on board. Next week we will have the Abbey Theatre, some of those who wrote the letter, and the Arts Council before the committee, because it is so important. Not to delve into the specifics, but what Gary said is the overarching. How did we get to this place? And how can we get out of it in some ways? It's not to be necessarily always argumentative, and I think those who are on the committee will hopefully benefit from that, but others will probably come and have their tuppence worth. The other part, which was interesting, because every year there's an arts budget, and the Minister has to come before the committee. So the Minister will be coming before us with the estimates on the 6th of March. So the information that you have given us arms us to argue with her that the budget that has been presented to us is not strong enough to deliver on policies that have been presented to the people and kind of platitudes given towards the arts over years. You know, put your money where your mouth is, or put your mouth where the money is. I don't know which in this context, but there was some talk of the cost-benefit analysis, and that everything. The first question is, show us where the investment is. That's been shown. That has been proven. There's no need for us to continue that argument. But I'm sorry to say that is the argument that prevails in the current climate, and that's why I think what there was a point in Mark's contribution, if I can find it, which I was interested if he could elaborate, because he said there are many imperatives and considerations which should determine which steps we take. That's in terms of shaping the future. Prominent amongst them should be the voice of artists, which I obviously no doubt, but educating influence of art. Because I think Theo, and maybe Philip yourself, alluded to it. We're a small country on the edge of the world, basically. We've had a huge influence, but in the future, it seems the world is going to be more technologically structured. But to do that, the world needs artists. They need people with imagination. We wouldn't have all of the new gadgets that we have, that kids are stuck on sometimes, or what you see in the street, what you see, unless somebody imagined. So unless we value imagination, and it's a hard one to quantify, unless we imagine it, or unless we put, I think what Margaret's talking, we educate the influence, everything that's happening in terms of technology, in terms of our future, art is stuck in there somewhere, our imagination. And that's important. So how do we get that across? And just, I'm not going to, like some people would know the influences on me from artists and everything to do with the arts and everything else. But I just know so many artists over the years, and the bravery and courage of those artists kind of who seek to reflect their imagination, their interpretation of the world, their music and that, and to eke out a living, because literally that's it. I've seen people in absolute dire straits, saved by other artists who have managed to kind of be a little bit better off. But I'd say the vast majority, the vast majority of those who are artists in this country have not made a living from art alone. And I think that's the biggest scandal, considering what you have said about the influence of Irish artists and art around the world in terms of our standing in the world, and that's economic as well as our standing as people. So if there's anything in what I said that you want to answer, fire away. If not,
I just agree with every word that you said, really. Absolutely. We have a magnificent resource. We are not tending that resource. We are not giving oxygen to that resource, which is a priceless resource, which cannot be just you can't apply the standard granular metric to the outcomes from this resource, because they're civilizing, they're humanizing, and your reference to technology and the all-pervasive, I suppose, screen life, if you like. You know, I mean, the antidote to that is going to be in the human, tactile, visceral engagement that is enabled by art and by its humanising quality. And it is something that will differentiate Ireland's offering to the world and to its own people. Of that, there is no doubt. And, you know, at the risk of repeating myself, we're looking a gift horse in the mouth. We've got it. We have the resource. We've got it. Other societies and places in the world would actually kill for what we have. Yeah. We just take it for granted that it's there and will tip away. We just need to be strategic. We need to be clever. We need to be thoughtful about this particular resource, and it will repay handsomely in every part of our lives, economically, socially, culturally and politically.
Can I, Chair, Neil Postman, who wrote, brilliant what you said there, Philip, he wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death and the Disappearance of Childhood, and before he died he wrote a book called Technopoly, and it was a very interesting book about the rise of technology. But one of the things he said, anything plugged in will not help you to become. I was very taken by it. will not help you to become. And it's exactly what you're saying, what all as you as artists and practitioners and writers and philosophers are saying, that without the human being and the tactile touch, smell, taste, voice, or voices of the human being, because now people make love without voices. You know, they communicate, I love you, I hate you, I want to meet you, without voice. So they don't come with tone anymore. You know, I thought it was nothing that's plugged in will help you to become. I thought it was most interesting. He wasn't talking about music now being plugged in, but he wasn't talking about that. He was talking about what technopoly can close down in the human being.
It's absolutely true. And that is the truth of it. If we tend this resource and husband it, it will repay us in ways that we cannot imagine.
This false idea of progress that's represented by the machine world is far more insidious and dangerous than we grant it. The late great Michael Hartnett said, thinking of that kind of progress, poets with progress make no peace or pact. The act of poetry is a rebel act. Yes. Now, the former Ireland Professor of Poetry, Paul Meehan, has been saying recently, you know, the machines have begun to groom us. The machines are teaching us to think in simplistic binary terms. We are adjusting our patterns of behaviour, our ways of being in the world to conform with the simplistic algorithms of our iPhones and our iPads and our small machines. And that is not what being human is about.
That's right.
So in that sense, we need to use these things, but in a rebellious and cranky way. I want to tell the Senator that the City of Seattle a couple of months ago put a series of billboards all over the city to tell people you cannot text 911. You have to actually use your voice to speak to a police operator. Now, there's a sign of things to come. I want to say to the Chair, I want to thank him first of all for the sense of welcome that I have felt, I think that we have felt here. To meet the state on these terms is, we could construe it as a right, but it's also a privilege and a pleasure. And I have the sense that this is seriously meant. My innate, natural, Cork-born scepticism is, for the moment, at bay. But I want to say, Chair, that there is one extremely useful thing that this committee can do, and it can call the Taoiseach on a promise. The Taoiseach said that he will double funding to the arts over a 10-year period. Well, the first thing, why should this not be front-loaded? Why should this be eked out bit by bit, increment by increment over a 10-year span? I would like to see, and I can imagine the rows in Merrion Street if you were to go and say it, but why not? Who's to be master? I remind you of this question. If we want to invest, Philip has made the case superbly for what a valuable investment it is in the arts. Gary and Mark have spoken to the human capital, the human resources of this nation that need to be fed. Why wait? Okay, we'll take him at his 10-year promise. Yes. Okay, we'll give him the primary benefit of it. But why does it have to be in 10% increments over 10 years? Put it up front now. Put 50% of that promise up next year and look at what you get for it. I remind you, your €21 gets you 147. I mean, what's not to like?
Gary and Mark, who any concluding comments? I know Philip's in a mad dash. Okay.
Comment, if you don't mind.
Very brief.
I'm not a member of the committee.
The deputy is going to speak about Strokestone.
Very brief, because I'm hoping to get a photograph with the four witnesses, and then we have.
I'm sure you won't put the photograph before my brief contribution.
Brief.
No, I'm not a member of the committee. And
you're in attendance, so you're allowed. Go ahead.
So I know that I can come in at the end, but I actually. You know, Theo, I think you've been down in Roscommon in my constituency at the Douglas Hyde Summer School. Gary has strong connections with County Roscommon as well. And, of course, Philip, I know from the radio. I spent 20 years in local radio on Shannside Northern Sound, and Niamh Smyth would know that very, very well. And I did a variation of programmes, produced and presented a variation of programmes, and I often played good ballad music as well, Mr. Warfield, down to that time. But the one thing that struck me in those years in doing documentaries and different was the amount of hidden talent, art-wise, that's out there. And you know, we have huge debates about depression and people's lives, you know, upside down, bunos, gone upside down. But, you know, I think if the government really were to come on board and, you know, properly support and finance the arts, and we have an able deputy in our own party to speak about that, it would be beneficial on several fronts. And that's why I just want to make that short contribution, Chair, and I thank you for allowing me. And I would be interested in promoting this, producing it, working with you, because I think it's a huge untapped area. And any of us that support the arts through the local radios or whatever, we can see that talent that is there. So I thank you for giving me a few minutes to speak on it.
Okay, Tommy, Gary, Craig, a coalition quid chin, don Crinu agus Arish Boalam ga Yanisha were Wakas a Gual, Lesh na Fine Avian Shaw, Gary Hines, Philip King, Mark Patrick Hederman, agus Theo Dorgan, Hanukkah Stock and Yov, agus Tá Cadagwif Bula Bossa Hort must mean live. For the members, if you want to join us in a photograph, very quick, Philip has to rush off, and then hang on because I have to go through business. So, Shin dereliction session, Usculta, so we now continue in private session.